Was the New Testament written hundreds of years after the events that it describes? That is the question that is facing us. It's a question that you've no doubt heard. It's a question that I've been asked countless times. And how are we to answer it? How are we to make sense of it? Because in 1 John 1 through 3, here's what it says. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you may also have fellowship with us. Is this claim true? Can we trust the Bible's claims that the gospel is the result of eyewitness testimony by people who were actually there? This is an incredibly important question. It is one that you must know how to answer if you are going to lead your family in the biblical worldview. And it's what we're talking about today on the Worldview Legacy Podcast. Why does this challenge matter? Well, this challenge matters because it implies that the accounts of the New Testament cannot be trusted. After all, if the New Testament was written hundreds of years after the fact, after the life of Jesus, and yet it claims to have been written by eyewitnesses, then you can't rely on those claims, but then also you also can't rely on, not only can you not rely on the New Testament when it claims to have been written by eyewitnesses, but also the very events that it describes probably didn't happen. Here's how we can illustrate this. Imagine that the year is 2224, 200 years in the future, and somebody pulls out an old photo album of their ancestors, and there you are looking so good right now in 2024. And your descendant, your distant descendant, hundreds of years from now, says, I want to find out as much as I can. I want to write the story of my ancestor. So they take out whatever the writing device they're using in 2224, and they start writing your story, and they tell about your childhood, and they give some details from your teenage years. And then they pick up your story around age 30, and they describe what you did from ages 30 to 33. Here's the question. How accurate is that account going to be? And of course, the answer is not very stinking accurate, because they're making it up 200 years in the future. And the further you go forward in time, the less knowledge that person, that pseudo biographer, is going to have about not only your life, but what the world was like, what people were named in 2024, what sort of technology we used, what sort of things we valued. The further you get from the actual events, the less reliable the accounts are going to be. So this is a big deal, because this is what is being alleged when it comes to the trustworthiness of the Bible, of the Gospels, of Acts in particular, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. So what I want to do in this episode is I want to show you how to reduce this argument to absurdity, and to show why it is nonsensical for a godless skeptic to appeal to history in order to try to undermine the truth and the validity of the gospel in the New Testament. In this episode, we're not going to give the positive evidence and arguments for the New Testament. And before my skeptical viewers go, that's because there is no positive evidence. Got you, stupid Christian. No, that's not why. We're going to get to that in another episode. In this episode, we're just going to reduce the skeptical position to absurdity. That's going to take up enough time, and then we'll move on. We'll give the positive evidence in the future in another episode. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, I'm talking to my Christians now. I'm talking to my Christian viewer who wants to know how to answer this. The first thing I want to warn you is this: beware of your first response. When your skeptical opponent tells you that the Bible was written much later, the first thing you're going to want to do, if you're anything like me, is to start breaking out the evidence. And you're going to Dan Wallace and J. Warner Wallace and all these great Norman Geisler, these guys who have studied the evidence, and you're going to want to give the evidence. I'm going to say, don't do that at first. Get to the evidence later, but don't start out with the evidence, because what that's going to do is, if you start with the evidence too soon, it's going to trap you in the apologetics cycle of doom. Not a place where you want to be. What is the apologetics cycle of doom? That's where your skeptic comes to you and says, I would believe in God and become a Christian if only I had more evidence or better arguments. So then what you do is you go out, you find the evidence. And guess what? There is ample evidence that the New Testament was written early by eyewitnesses. And you're going to bring that evidence back to your skeptic, and you're going to say, ha, here's the evidence. And they're going to go, I am not convinced. Not today, Christian. Get out of here with that. I need better evidence. And then you go and you find better evidence or more evidence. You bring it back and they go, I don't accept that. This all appeals to miracles, and we know that miracles can't be true. So, I don't accept any of this. I remain unconvinced. That is called the apologetic cycle of doom. You do not want to get caught in that. Instead, you're going to do what the Bible teaches. You're going to do it the biblical way. You're going to address the underlying presuppositions or foundational assumptions that your skeptical friend, your opponent, is making. After you address those, then you go on to making a positive case. But you need to beware that first response that says, jump right into the evidence. There's so much evidence. Jump into the evidence. Don't jump right into the evidence at first. Do not get caught in the cycle of doom. And don't give the skeptic the false impression that you believe that he is neutral and that all it would take would be a little bit more evidence to convince him. He's not neutral. You know that. I know that. He might not know that, but God knows it. And we know that from Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. It talks there in that passage about how men know God, but suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That's what's going on, and that is what we're going to reveal. Now, why are we going to reveal this? To destroy our skeptic? To annihilate him? To obliterate him and make him feel like an idiot for the rest of his life? Absolutely not. We are going to reduce the argument to absurdity out of love. And you say, how is destroying arguments an act of love? Here's why. As long as people feel like they can cling to the driftwood of their excuses and arguments against God, then they'll never realize that they've already sunk, they're already spiritually dead, and they need Jesus. They need Jesus. And by you uncovering the absurdity of their worldview, it's going to bring them one step closer, or at least give them the opportunity to move one step closer to the cross of Jesus Christ. So let's get into reducing the argument to absurdity and addressing the question of, is the Bible actually written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses and by eyewitnesses? Okay, so step one, we're going to reduce this position to absurdity. Step one is we have to clarify the position. In order to adequately respond, you need to know what your skeptical friend is really talking about. So you're going to ask certain questions. The reason why we do this should be obvious to you. It ought to be obvious, but it's simply the fact that we don't want to respond to something that they don't actually believe. We don't want to start taking this train down the wrong track. We want to answer the objection that they're actually making. We want to address their worldview as it actually stands. So here are 5 questions that you're going to ask when someone says the New Testament was written later, not by eyewitnesses. It was written centuries after the fact, after Christ. Question 1. When you say that the New Testament was written centuries later, what do you mean by that? How many centuries are we talking about? Okay, we're clarifying the objection. Question 2. Is it absolutely true that a historical account written hundreds of years later is less reliable than an early account written by eyewitnesses? Again, I believe that. You believe that. Does he believe that? We're clarifying the objection. Question 3. By what standard should we judge the historical reliability of a document? It's important to ask, by what standard? Question 4. How did you come to believe that the New Testament was written centuries later? Can you cite me a source? Can you tell me about how you came on this journey? What was your journey like that got you to arrive at this conclusion? And then question 5. If the New Testament were written later, what would be the implications of that? In other words, why should that matter? Or we might say, so what? As Jeff Durbin likes to put it, so what? So really what we're asking is, we're saying, what do you mean by that? We're saying, is that absolutely true? We're saying, by what standard? We're saying, how did you come to believe that? Or why do you believe that? And we're saying, so what? These are your standard boilerplate questions that you want to get into in any apologetics conversation before you perform a reductio ad absurdum. Meaning, before you reduce the skeptical opinion, the skeptical position to absurdity, ask good, clarifying questions. By asking these questions, again, this is an act of love. You are sharing you are seeking to draw out your skeptic's viewpoint so that you can address it in love, so that you can lead them to the foot of the cross of Jesus Christ. All right, now that you have clarified your friend's position, now you're ready to identify the internal contradiction and bring it to light. Here we go. Your goal is you want to find the conflict between the destination that he's trying to get to and his starting point. His destination is that the New Testament is untrustworthy. That's the whole point of this argument. It's the New Testament is untrustworthy, therefore you can't believe it. Therefore, by the way, I'm not accountable to follow Jesus. I'm not accountable to repent of my sins because, hey, the New Testament's not trustworthy. Okay, his starting point, his basic presupposition is what? What would you say that his basic presupposition is? What is his basic assumption? I can think of two. One, that there are rules by which we must do history, and two, that the past is knowable. One, there are rules. Two, the past is knowable, or we can know the past. We want to expose these principles. That is key, and we're going to draw out these assumptions. All right, let's talk about this first assumption. The assumption is that there are rules. Here's the rule. A historical account is more likely to be true if it's written early and by eyewitnesses. That is a rule. Ironclad rule of history. Listen, I have a degree in history. I have a BA in history from Grove City College, and I can tell you this is an assumption that goes into historical research. The closer you can get to the source, the closer you can get to the moment when an event happened, those accounts are going to be more trustworthy. And yes, I know eyewitness testimony is not infallible in all cases. In fact, it can be very unreliable, but it's certainly a lot more reliable than someone just writing what they think hundreds of years later. J. Warner Wallace talks about how there are two kinds of evidence: direct evidence and indirect evidence. Direct evidence is eyewitness testimony. Indirect evidence is literally everything else. So we want to get back to that direct evidence. We want to get back to that eyewitness testimony. And the rule of history is that if you have eyewitness testimony, it's more likely to be reliable. That is a rule. So that's the first assumption, that there is a rule, and here's what it is. Second, we are assuming, our skeptic is assuming, that the past can be known. It's possible to study history and to learn what happened in the past. The universe didn't just pop into existence 5 seconds ago, and some alien didn't implant you with false memories. Now that I said that, now you're wondering, right? How do I know that the universe didn't pop into existence 5 seconds ago and that I wasn't just given false memories? Well, listen, if you're a skeptic, if you're a non-Christian, I don't know why you don't believe that. I'm not going to speak for you. I think that your worldview is wrong. If you're a Christian, we're going to see in a future episode, we have great reason for believing that the universe did not pop into existence 5 seconds ago, and you and I were not given false memories planted in our minds. But these are the assumptions that the skeptic is assuming and bringing, you might say presupposing, bringing to the argument, bringing to the debate. Now, the question is, does the skeptic have a good reason for assuming these things? Does the skeptic have a good reason for assuming that there are rules which govern history and that the past can be knowable, that the past can actually be known? Well, what we want to do now as a Christian, as an apologist, is we want to push the skeptic towards the absurdity of his worldview. Now, this might seem like the exact opposite of something that you want to do. Why would I push them further in to their absurd worldview? Don't I want to lead them out of it? Yes. But what we're doing is we're acting like a good home inspector. If you've ever bought a house, you know that the home inspector will take you down into the basement to examine the foundation. That's what we're doing. We're going down into the skeptical worldview to look at the foundation. And we're going to go, wow, look at the cracks in this worldview. This can't possibly support the house. This foundation is totally faulty. Here's how we're going to do this. We're going to start by addressing the first assumption. Remember, the first assumption is that there are rules governing our historical research, our inquiry into the past. So you might say something like this. It seems to me like you believe that a historical account is more likely to be true if it's written earlier and by eyewitnesses. Is that a rule? Is that a rule? Well, rules, obligations require a rule giver. Without God, there's nothing to keep those rules enforced, and there's nothing to originate those rules. And by the way, there's nothing to keep those rules from changing over time. Think about this. Today, we might say it is an ironclad rule of history that a document that is written earlier, an account written earlier and by eyewitnesses, is more reliable than one that is written later by non-eyewitnesses. Okay, that's a rule today. But wait a minute, if there's no God, how do we know that rule was enforced and in place 300, 500, 2,000 years ago? Maybe, and I'm speaking like an absurd person here because this is an absurd view, and we're pushing them towards the absurdity. Maybe it's actually the fact that in Jesus' day or in the year 300, let's say, the best way to study history was to open up your mind to the divine universe and say, what happened 300 years ago? And then the knowledge would just be dropped into your mind. And you say, well, that's crazy. No one believes that. I agree. I don't believe that. But as a skeptic, why don't you believe that? Well, because I just don't believe that. Why? What's keeping these rules enforced, in place, unchanging over time? Without God as the divine rule giver, there's no reason to believe that these rules aren't changing over time. Okay, so that's the first assumption. Without God, why are there rules? Without the rule giver, there are no rules. And those rules certainly aren't unchanging over time. Now let's address the second assumption. The second assumption is that the past can be known. But wait a minute. Without divine revelation from God, how can you possibly know that the past can be known at all? Now, as a Christian, of course, I believe the past can be known. Why do I believe the past can be known? Because I have a book called the Bible, which is a collection of 66 different books written over a period of 1,500 years by 40 different authors, most of whom didn't know each other. It was written in 3 languages, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, and it was written on 3 modern-day continents, and yet it has one cohesive account of history, and we call this the authoritative record of history. And it indicates to me not only that history has meaning, but even more basic than that, history can be known. The past can be known. I have a book that tells me that. It's an authoritative book. But the skeptic has no such authoritative book, no such authoritative record of the past, no such authoritative interpretation of the past. So my question to the skeptic is, why think that the past can be known at all? And you might say, oh, because we dig up things and we unearth these ancient documents. Okay, but now you're just appealing to the rules of history again. Do you see what I'm saying? Now you're just back to the idea that there are rules governing our historical research, which without God, why would I think that there are rules? Without God's authoritative revelation, why would I think that the past can be known, can be sensible? How do I know that the past is not constantly in a state of flux, that the past is even static at all? In other words, how do I know that the Aztecs aren't popping in and out of existence 500 years ago? And this is like, man, this is so crazy. What are you talking about? Yes, I agree that it's crazy, but without the divine rule giver and without the divine authoritative record of the past that tells us that the past can be known, in other words, without God and his word, you can't believe consistently that the past can be known and that there are rules governing how we interact with the past. Okay, do you see what we've done? We have pushed the skeptic deeper into his worldview and shown that by eliminating God from the worldview at the beginning, he has eliminated the possibility for historical inquiry and research. There are no rules governing history. There's no authoritative record of the past, and there's no meaning that we can ascribe to the past with any degree of certainty at all. We have eliminated the possibility of studying history. So what does this mean for our skeptic who now wants to who now wants to say that the history of the Bible is inauthentic and it was written much later, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what we've shown is that the skeptic, by arbitrarily assuming that God is not there from the beginning, can't even begin to make this argument. It is literally nonsensical for a skeptic to say the Bible is unreliable. We know this from history. No, you don't know anything from history, Mr. Skeptic. You literally can't know anything because you don't have the rules that govern historical research. You don't have the principle that earlier eyewitness accounts are more reliable than later non-eyewitness accounts, and you don't have an authoritative interaction with the past, an authoritative record of the past at all. If God has not spoken authoritatively about the past, you have no basis for even the tiniest bit of certainty, because there could be let me put on my Cy Ten Bruggencate hat right now and tell you this. There could be a fact about the past which negates everything that you think that you know as you study history, okay, without an authoritative record of the past, like the Bible. So what that means is that everything you think you know about the past is now uncertain. But if you're uncertain about it, then you don't actually know it with any degree of certainty. What that means is you can't interact with the past. You can't study history. What have we done? We have reduced the skeptical, non-Christian position to absurdity. We've unveiled, we've uncovered the internal contradiction in our opponent's point of view. He wants you to believe in the rules that govern history. He wants you to believe that the past can be known and the past has meaning. But in his very own worldview, those things are completely undercut and destroyed. In other words, the emperor has no clothes, the foundation has cracks in it, it can't support the house, and we have now done away with this idea that the skeptic can appeal to history to negate the Bible. Now, I'm going to answer your questions in just a minute, but first, let me just say that if you enjoy this kind of learning and you want to take your learning further, you need to know about the Hammer and Anvil Society. You are a Christian man. You want to build a legacy. You want to train up your children in the way that they should go, provide a secure foundation for your family in God's word. But everywhere you look, you see decline, disorder, and chaos. Your neighbors don't know Christ, and too many churches are filled with apathy. Right now, we need men who understand how to give arguments like this rooted in Scripture and how to defend the truth of Scripture. So that's why we're building the Hammer and Anvil Society, the ultimate discipleship community for Christian men. You're going to get weekly cohort calls, live teaching and challenges, and a library of courses to sharpen your apologetics, to sharpen your mind and your character. Our full library of courses is going to deepen your understanding of the Christian worldview, of family discipleship, of apologetics foundations, and of advanced apologetics. But it's not just about the knowledge. It's about brotherhood through an online community for accountability and fellowship with like-minded Christian men. You can learn more about the Hammer and Anvil Society and the impact that it's having on Christian men just like you by simply going to thethink.institute/society, thethink.institute/society. Go to thethink.institute/society now to learn more. You can get unlimited access to all of our courses as a member, or you can try out a course a la carte. Our courses are generally 8 weeks long. Try it out by going to thethink.institute/society. All right. Well, this episode has been produced by Joel Sedekase. That's me, yours truly, and is a production of the Think Institute. We are a Christian teaching and outreach-based nonprofit funded by like-minded individuals like yourself. You can help support the mission by going to thethink.institute, and we are based by God's grace. Until next time, I hope it made you think. All right, now let's get into your comments. All right, looks like, hey, wow. Richie has sent in it looks like a super thanks for $9.99. Richie, thank you so much, brother. I truly appreciate this. I hope that this was really beneficial to you. And then Richie had a comment. He says, they can be credible, but only because they start with Christian assumptions. Okay, what's he talking about? Richie, I'm giving you these comments out of order, but Richie is responding to someone else who made the comment, are eyewitnesses be credible for all religions or just Christianity? Ooh, that is a really good question. Okay, eyewitness testimony and earlier accounts are more credible than non-eyewitness testimony and accounts that are written much after the fact. And then that just goes without saying. If someone's writing your biography 300 years from now and they don't know who you are, they don't know what life was like back here in 2024. Well, of course, their account's going to be less reliable than your daily journal that you're writing today in 2024. But that's true. That principle is true because there is a divine lawgiver. So eyewitness accounts about Muhammad or Joseph Smith, or, pick your religious founder. Those eyewitness early accounts are more reliable, but that's because God is real. That's because the Christian worldview is true. So if you go to another religion and you say, well, they've got eyewitness accounts as well. Okay, fantastic. Does their worldview actually support the idea that early eyewitness accounts are more reliable? Or does the God of that worldview, of that religion, act in a capricious way, in a way that is self-contradictory? Does that quote unquote holy book actually provide a basis for historical research? And if not, then it undercuts itself and the very argument that they would make for their religion. Hey, I've got eyewitness accounts. Well, that's really great. I'm glad you have eyewitness testimony, but that eyewitness testimony matters because my worldview, biblical Christianity, is true. And so that's why when Richie says they can be credible, but only because they start with Christian presuppositions or assumptions, that's exactly right. If you start with the assumption that the Bible is true, then you get historical research. Then you get historical reliability. Okay, now, display name says this. What if it were culturally rooted through the Gurukul system, teacher to students, and supported by followed traditions until today? Okay, again, if I understand what you're saying, I don't know what the Gurukul system is, Gurukul. I don't know what that is, but if that is the idea of passing down oral tradition from a teacher down to the present time, fantastic. That's great, as long as the tradition that was passed down was not mangled along the way. Now, what does this have to do with biblical Christianity? Because we too, we're here we are in 2024. We're not living in the first century. How do we know that the eyewitness accounts are still reliable today, that they haven't been mangled? This is where textual criticism comes in. Now, if you're talking about an oral tradition that is merely passed down, oral traditions, even if you're coming out of a culture that takes oral tradition very seriously, over time, those oral traditions may or may not be corrupted. How do we know? Well, we don't know. That's why we need written traditions, written manuscript and manuscript evidence. And that, with Christianity, that is what we have. So that's outside the bounds of this particular episode that we're talking about. But Christianity has thousands and tens of thousands of manuscripts that we can go back and scrutinize from different traditions, from different lines of manuscript copying, and we can compare them over hundreds of years, separated by vast regions, and we can compare and say, okay, these manuscripts are authentic, and we can then say, what did the original manuscripts say? We call them the autographs, the original manuscripts. What did they say? And we can actually know what the originals did in fact say. So that's why manuscript evidence trumps oral tradition every time. It's not that the oral tradition necessarily gets corrupted, although I would say it probably does. It definitely does, just speaking out of common sense. But it's the fact that we can't know what the oral tradition said until they're written down. So it's a matter of epistemology, as well as it is anything else. Epistemology meaning, how do we know what we know? Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope this was helpful. And you know what? If you have more questions and you want to write in, go ahead and do this. Send your questions to thethink.institute/contact. That will go directly to myself or someone from our team and we will then be able to take those questions, and maybe your question will end up on a future episode, or maybe I'll respond to you directly if I can. But God bless you. I hope this was helpful. And remember, you can share and defend your Christian faith with absolute confidence. God's word is true. The Gospels were written early, and the skeptic does not have a leg to stand on. So hopefully this was helpful. Hope it made you think. Until next time, talk to you later.